Full disclosure, I have personally fallen for each of these 8 audiophile mistakes, and in fact, I still do all the time, even though I know about them. Hey folks, I'm Mark Ryan. This is Super Review, and lately, I've been posting content talking about some common audiophile myths that I just don't think make a big difference when it comes to sound quality. Things like upgrade cables, or different DACs and amps, and even lossless audio. And as I'm publishing these videos, I'm getting feedback from the audience that's kind of falls into 3 different categories. Of course, I get people that agree with me, which is nice to see. Of course, I get the haters who think I'm deaf and need more highly resolving gear. But the 3rd category of response I think is the most interesting. They're people who are not super certain, but they're kind of incredulous. It's like, okay, maybe it's true these things don't make a big difference when it comes to sound quality, but why do people spend thousands of dollars on it? Well, in this episode of Waveguide, I'm going to try and answer that question by talking about 8 common biases and mistakes that audiophiles make, including myself. And if you like the idea of helpful content like this, you're also going to like our sponsor, HiFiGo. HiFiGo is an online retailer of IEMs and headphones. They've got all the latest gear. They ship worldwide for free. So check them out, linked down below, and then come back here and let's talk about how us audiophiles fool ourselves all the time. Now, before we get started, I want to be clear up front that this video is not meant to mock and insult audiophiles for 2 reasons. 1, I am an audiophile. These are mistakes, like I've said before, that I have made in the past and I continue to make all the time. And then the other thing is that while we're talking about audio and audiophiles, these biases and mistakes are frankly just much bigger than this hobby. You're going to see them in other hobbies, you'll see them at work, you'll see them in politics. Audio really is just a microcosm of human biases. For example, expectation bias. If you have a preconception about how something is going to sound before you've heard it, your mind is going to kind of naturally hear it the way you thought you were going to hear it. So some examples of things you might have preconceptions about is if you hear something that's expensive, you might expect that it sounds better than something that's cheap. Or maybe there's something new and it's hyped by the community, you might expect to hear it a certain way. Or if something's called pro, you might expect it to sound a certain way. I think burn-in is another example of an expectation bias, where if you have the expectation that the sound of your product is going to change with time, well, you might hear it that way. And it can also work the other way, whereas if you expect something to sound bad because, I don't know, you think it looks cheap or whatever, that can also, your mind can reinforce that expectation. Here's some common ways that expectation bias looks. Let's say you're listening to a new upgraded version of a product and you start to notice details in the music that you never noticed before. Well, they could be new details, or it could just be you're paying attention and because you expect it to sound better, you notice them. Or let's say you come away from listening to an expensive product that you expected to sound good. You might just say it has a special sauce. You can't really pin it down, but it's expensive. It's got a special sauce about it. That's kind of an example of an expectation bias. Or let's say you've heard everybody likes the Audio-Technica M50X and you go and you listen to it and you actually like it. I don't know how to explain that apart from expectation bias. Now, it can be kind of easy to trivialize and like underestimate really how powerful expectation bias can be. But I was talking with my buddy Juan the other day, and he reminded me that about 6 months ago, people in New Jersey were freaking out about giant drones off the coast. And it's not because there were actually giant drones off the coast. It's just that people had started talking about it and speculating about it. And every time people went out, they would see lights in the sky from airplanes and other things, and they would interpret it as drones in the sky. Even politicians started freaking out. So just kind of goes to show how powerful this bias can be. Kind of a subset of this expectation bias is letting physical attributes of the product influence the way that you hear them. For example, with cables, you might hear a copper cable as sounding warm or a silver cable as sounding bright and analytical. Or maybe you hear a transparent IEM like this sound transparent and clear and natural. Or maybe you hear something that feels and looks cheap is sounding kind of cheap. Now those examples are pretty on the nose, but this effect can be a lot more subtle than that. For example, let's say you feel good about a product because you like the way that it looks and it feels. Well, that might influence the way that you feel about the sound. I'm personally very susceptible to this. My buddy Jadis was talking about this, how if something is comfortable or uncomfortable, that can subconsciously influence the way he feels about the sound. And then my buddy Adrian was saying and pointing out that the knob feel on an amplifier can actually change the way that things sound. Let's say a knob is like kind of scratchy and rough. It might make you start feeling like this amplifier feels a little bit rough. Or something that's even more subtle than that is like the ramp of the volume on an amplifier knob. It might make it so that you feel like you just got more control over the volume, and that might make you feel like it sounds better, or it might just make it easier to get louder, which is going to lead us into our next mistake, which is not controlling variables. Sometimes it's not just in your head. There is a real difference that's being heard, but it might not be the difference that you think it is because you're not accurately controlling variables. And one of those common variables that people fail to accurately control is volume. Generally, if something's louder, it pretty much just always sounds better. So if you're comparing amplifiers, it's very easy to have one of them be subtly louder than the other, and that's going to just inherently make it sound a little bit better. Or in my video talking about lossless audio, I had a number of people saying Apple Music sounds better than Spotify. And then I also had a couple other people saying that Apple Music sounds louder than Spotify. So it's not really a surprise to me that some people think that it sounds better. Some other variables that might sneak into your audio comparisons, let's go back to that example of Spotify versus Apple. Let's say you're trying to hear the difference between lossy and lossless compression, but you might end up actually listening to two different masters of the same music because the surfaces just happen to have different masters. Well, you're not going to be able to hear the difference between lossy and lossless because the masters are different. There's a variable that you're not controlling for. Or let's say you're comparing two different headphone amplifiers and one of them has high output impedance. That output impedance is going to make certain headphones sound warmer and bassier. And then you might think that that amplifier is warmer and bassier. But if you use another headphone on that same amplifier, it might be brighter. It might have no effect on it. So you're just not controlling the variables. Or another thing, I actually saw this once in an audio show. I saw someone trying to compare two different cables with two different copies of the same headphone, right? So it was easy to go from one headphone to the next, which is kind of smart, but also the unit variation between two different headphones is frankly a lot bigger than the difference between cables. So if you heard any difference, the likelihood that that difference came from the cable is just very small because you're not controlling that variable. I'm kind of reminded too of like going to audio shows and listening to gear with music that you're not familiar with. Like you're not familiar with that music. You can't really tell what that headphone sounds like. And like, I'm not a speaker guy, but I imagine speaker audio shows are especially useless, like especially if you're trying to hear an amplifier in a room that you've never been in with speakers you've never heard before and music that's not your own. Like the amplifier is the thing of all those variables that's making the least amount of difference. And unless you control those variables, you're not going to hear the amplifier. A lot of times, us audiophiles think that we can hear things that normal people can't, either because maybe we've got super special hearing, or maybe we're just well-trained, very experienced listeners, or a lot of the times it's because we've spent a lot of money and we've got highly resolving gear. But the truth is that like audiophiles miss obvious stuff all the time. In fact, like at audio shows, there are frequently times when I'll pick up a piece of gear and I can tell that the left and the right channel are mixed up. Or there have been times when I've noticed that the polarity is inverted on one side, and like that's just an obvious mistake that in a room full of audiophiles, nobody noticed for days. Another example is like I've bought used gear before and it's arrived with some pretty obvious and awful channel imbalances that frankly nobody noticed when they were using the gear at home. Which just kind of goes to show like we don't really have super special hearing. In fact, the people whose opinions I trust the most, they never make claims about super special hearing. In fact, they're usually the people that are the most aware of the limitations of their hearing, and they're also aware of these biases and mistakes that we make all the time, and they factor that kind of stuff in when they say stuff, which is why I trust them. Now that last example reminds me of a pretty tricky concept that's behind a lot of this, which is epistemology. And that is, how do we know what we know? And I promise this is relevant, but let's take a common audiophile understanding, which I describe as the purity myth, right? And it's the understanding that you get better sound quality by making your audio system more pure. This understanding will bring about concerns with things like balanced cables or power conditioners or lifting cables up off the ground or even using like bit perfect audio. And it's true in some ways that these things can improve sound quality, sometimes actually pretty drastically, but it's when they're applied to solving very specific problems. And these problems are going to be obvious, right? Maybe there's a ground loop in your system, or maybe there's electronic interference. But the claims that making your sound system more pure is going to bring out more resolution in soundstage, are they wrong? Implicit in a lot of what I'm saying when I'm criticizing these audiophile myths is that if you didn't know the change was made, I don't think you'd hear the difference that you're describing. For example, if you're in like a blind A/B test scenario, a lot of people's claims about soundstage and resolution and total balance changes from cables and amplifiers, I think they've just completely vanished. People would lose confidence in being able to make these claims, which for me means they don't really matter. Now, a lot of people disagree with that. Sometimes it's because they don't want to do blind A/B testing. And frankly, I don't blame them. It's not fun. I actually don't recommend it to anybody. Most of the things I enjoy in life, I enjoy perfectly fine without blind A/B testing, like my food. But then there are also some people who actively think that blind A/B testing is a bad way of knowing, that that's not how you prove that you can tell the difference between sources. You can only prove that by living with an amplifier and enjoying it throughout the day. And if at the end of the day you feel fatigued, well, that's how you know that the amplifier is bad. And to me, that just sounds like someone telling me that they like to eat boogers. Like, okay, but it just kind of goes to show that there are different ways of knowing. And for me, my method is like kind of like the scientific method. Now, admittedly, it is a half-assed scientific method, but because I review gear, I try to stick to something that's a little bit more concrete. Quick aside on blind testing, like even if you are doing blind testing, it's still possible for audiophiles to fool ourselves because we misunderstand probability, right? If you get 5 out of 10 on a blind A/B test, congratulations, you're as good as a literal coin flip. Or even getting like 8 out of 10 on a blind A/B test can feel like, okay, I got 8 out of 10, that's pretty good. But even in like a random chance world, there's a 5% chance that that is a random result, which is enough that if you're like a scientific researcher, you're gonna throw out that result as noise. Frankly, getting 0 out of 10 would be a better result because that actually shows that you heard a difference. It just might mean that you ended up preferring the thing that you didn't think you did. Speaking of science, let's talk about how measurements can help us fool ourselves, specifically by like using the wrong measurements. For example, a lot of headphones will use their frequency range as a way of differentiating headphones. Like this headphone can produce between 20 hertz and 20,000 hertz, and this other headphone can produce between 5 hertz and 40,000 hertz. This is a completely meaningless specification because you cannot hear 40,000 hertz. I promise you. And yet it is a claim that is made in basically every headphone marketing material out there. And then there's also like a lot of the source gear that, I don't know, I guess I just kind of dismiss, does actually have real measurable differences, just most of it happens below the threshold of human hearing. Like balanced versus single-ended amplifiers, right? I tend to dismiss balanced amplifiers, but a lot of people like them and they'll point to real advantages that they have in terms of total harmonic distortion or crosstalk measurements. Like, I believe those measurements are true. They exist. They are advantages, but they exist below the threshold of human hearing. And for me, they're overshadowed by the trade-offs, which are sometimes not below the threshold of human hearing. For example, a lot of balanced amplifiers and sources that I hear have double the noise floor versus their single-ended sides. And what does, a difference of 0.001% harmonic distortion sound like? I couldn't tell you. But the difference between double the noise floor, you don't need to be an audiophile to hear that. And then there are some extreme examples I've seen of people measuring the wrong thing. Some things I've seen on YouTube. Like one guy was measuring audiophile power cables by hooking them up to the back of a stereo and seeing which power cable had the best FM radio signal. Power cables. Okay. Somebody else was measuring sound isolation devices, which are basically rubber pads that you put underneath audio gear, I guess. And they were measuring the effectiveness of this by measuring how much vibration gets transmitted through them, which kind of makes sense, except that you remember that the point of this product is to improve the sound quality. So maybe measure the sound, right? To measure the sound of something like that, if this is making a difference in the sound quality, is like subject yourself to a blind A/B listening, rather than coming up with some weird, bizarre measurement that's just going to end up confirming what you wanted it to. But even when we use the right measurements, we're still susceptible to another mistake, and that's overconfidence. And this is something I have to remind myself about all the time. If something graphs good, doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to like it, and vice versa. Because, look, the more you understand about how measurements are made, the more you should start to also understand the limitations of measurements, right? They are true within a certain set of conditions, but reality might be different, right? An artificial ear is not your ear. So when you see a measurement on an artificial ear, just know that when it gets to your ear, it might be slightly different, and factor that into your confidence with the measurements. And frankly, overconfidence in measurements is kind of just another form of expectation bias, which I guess brings us back to where we started. Now, I'm not trying to say that we're always fooling ourselves when we hear differences between cables and amplifiers. And I'm not trying to say that you need to have a double-blind test in order to justify your opinion. I think we should enjoy the hobby however we want. Just keep in mind all the different ways that we can and often do fool ourselves, and do with that what you wish. And again, thanks to HiFiGo for sponsoring waveguide and making these videos possible. Make your next purchase of a headphone or an IM through the link in the description down below. And while you're down there, if you haven't already, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, ding the YouTube bell, join me on Discord, also linked down below, and I'll catch you on the next super review. Cheers.
Join with the force of reviews. We now have the tools to brave the misleading world of audio fools. Hey, this review is super, and so are you. Grab your headphones, sniff a graph, and share your thoughts in this pursuit. Let's get into the future.